It's here, it's finally time. I am genuinely excited to be able to share this video with you guys today. The new GT4 Pack for Assetto Corsa Competizione is going to be available in a couple of days' time, and let me tell you right up front that these cars really do add something to the sim. I've had them for a couple of weeks now to test out and to make this video, and quite honestly, it's been a lot more fun than I expected. But anyway, enough preamble, let's just get to it. Hello fellow sim racers. I will warn you now that this video is going to be quite a bit longer than my normal videos because, well, I really wanted to do these 11 cars justice. So I'm going to be putting timestamps in the video description so you can skip around to whatever is most interesting to you. Though, of course, obviously, I'd prefer it if you watch the whole thing. In addition, if you have any particular favourite cars that you want to see in racing conditions, then I've uploaded a 10-minute quick race for each of the cars on my second channel. All in all, that's nearly 3 hours of GT4 content for those that really want to immerse themselves. The GT4 pack for ACC contains 11 new cars for the sim, 42 new liveries, GT4 specific rules for single and multiplayer modes, and of course the accompanying version 1.5 update when it brings multi-class racing to the sim. So let's unpack that a little further, starting with the shiny new toys. This pack, unsurprisingly, represents the cars fielded in the 2019 GT4 European Series, run of course by those friendly chaps at SRO. And that means that the cars are as follows. The beautiful Alpine A110 GT4. Aston Martin's GT4 flavour of the Vantage. The Audi R8 LMS GT4. The not at all like its DTM namesake BMW M4, one of my favourites, the moderately deafening Chevrolet Camaro GT4, Ginetta's GT4 variant of the ever-popular G55, KTM's X-Bow GT4, which is somehow even more fever dream spaceship pencils up your nostrils bonkers than the road-going one, Maserati's civilised by comparison MC GT4. Now, of course, there's a McLaren, this time around in 570S flavour, and the AMG GT also gets a GT4 makeover. Rounding out the list is, of course, a Porsche, the 718 Cayman GT4. All in all, not a bad haul. But if you're not super familiar with GT4 racing, then you might be wondering why these cars are interesting. I mean, they're slower than GT3 cars, right? What's the point? GT4 is primarily an amateur and pro-am category. If you've ever been to a race meeting with GT4 on the bill, then you'll have likely noticed that the mix of drivers ranging from youngsters climbing the GT ladder to older gentleman racers. And that combination usually leads to some pretty spicy racing in my experience. And that's of course aided by the design of the cars as well. Yes, as I mentioned earlier, they are slower than the GT3 cars, and this is largely due to a reduction in both power and aerodynamics. In terms of the former, GT4 cars are a fair chunk down on their GT3 counterparts, but it's the latter that really eats into the lap time, and these cars are just so much better for their relative lack of downforce. First of all, aero wash is just almost non-existent in these cars, which means you can run very close to other cars without taking a performance hit. Bump drafting through Eau Rouge? Why not? Next on the list of positives is that these cars just feel very much more mechanical to drive. In fact, the underlying handling characteristics of the road-going versions of each car are just much more apparent than in their GT3 variations. And that means that the driving experience, as well as the performance differential, varies a lot more from car to car in the GT4 class. You really can feel a lot with these cars. You can lean on them in a way that just feels a lot more natural than the more sensitive aero cars. That makes sense, of course, but it's great to be able to feel it for yourself. Aerodynamics being less of a focus means that the minimum ride heights are also much closer to road car range than they are to the GT3 cars, which of course run incredibly low to the ground to make the best use of the spacious floor area for generating downforce. This has some enormous benefits when it comes to tackling curbs. No longer must you fear the sausage. In fact, don't nibble, just swallow. Swallow them whole like a hungry Doberman unleashed upon an unsuspecting branch of Greg's. This does change the racing line in more than a few places, and some of the more frustrating parts of circuits like, say, the chicane at Hungaroring or, well, all of Zolder, is all of a sudden a really fun place to race. And then there's the GT4 rule set itself, which imposes some slightly different restrictions on how you race the cars. The biggest of which is that tyre blankets are not used, so you leave the pits or the start line with tyres that are just miles from the optimum range, which makes the first couple of laps a bit more of an adventure. Again, this is something that helps keep the racing close and exciting. Look, the TLDR here is that these cars are just great fun to drive and offer better racing than their big brothers in GT3. What more could you want? And please don't say Nordschleifer. Next up, we're going to start digging into each of the cars in the pack and using that as a framework to talk about what's so interesting about the GT4 driving and racing experience, or to put it another way, the bit that you're all here for. It was only a few weeks ago that we were reading of the likely demise of the Alpine A110 road car. Thankfully, it appears that Renault intends to keep going with production until 2024, which both keeps an interesting car being made and ensures that the GT4 version is relevant for just a little while longer. The Alpine GT4 is one of only a few cars in the pack to have been significantly tuned up in the power department from the road-going version, with that diminutive 1.8-litre turbocharged engine. On top of the power boost is the usual stuff: roll cage, fire suppression, racing seats, and an aero package that surprisingly suits the look of the car. And all in all, it's a pretty tidy looking racing car, at least to my eyes. But that's not what you're all here for. Let's talk driving. The Alpine is a refined driving experience, and honestly it's probably as good a starting point in the pack as any, not just because it's first alphabetically, but because it is very neutral. Once the tyres are up to temperature, this is a car that just sort of does what it's told, and more importantly, goes where you want it to. Compared to the other cars in the pack, it does seem pretty similar in terms of acceleration and top end, which of course you would expect thanks to the BOP measures, though that's not always the case. Stick around for a couple of examples of that. But these cars do play tricks on you. Some are heavily restricted from their road-going model to meet the power requirements of GT4, while others, like the Alpine, they've had a tune-up. So in terms of sound and feel, it's quite easy to get misled about how much grunt there actually is. All in all, the Alpine, like many of the cars in the rest of the pack, offers a much more mechanical feel than the GT3 counterparts. It's a fun, if slightly vanilla car. It is nice and dependable, but it's probably not going to have you doing your best John Cusack impression, boombox held aloft while Peter Gabriel plays. Say anything you like about the road-going Alpine, but the GT4 version in ACC is a delight. The baby Aston's little brother, as Jeremy Clarkson probably wouldn't have put it, is going to be a popular choice in Assetto Corsa Competizione. Just like its GT3 big brother, this is a quick car with a little bit of an edge, and that's usually a pretty good place to start for a popularity contest. It features the same Mercedes twin-turbo V8 used in the GT3 version, and in the AMG GT4 for that matter, though obviously in both cases they're tuned to produce GT4-friendly power and torque figures. And that does expose a couple of things that it'll take a little bit of a while to get used to with these cars. The rev range often feels a little bit odd. The cars can feel a bit held back at the top end for obvious reasons, but equally downshifting feels a little bit odd until you mentally adjust to the fact that you're just not going as quickly. To begin with, getting a successful downshift felt a bit like trying to have a rally with Roger Federer. You're eventually going to get one past him, but only if you ask very nicely. I of course exaggerate massively here, and once you adjust to what the engine and gearbox expect of you, the driver, it's all good news. The Aston Martin is one of the pointier front-engine cars. This seems to make it very quick in, well, most places honestly, but the rotation in slow corners is particularly impressive, at least in my hands. It takes curbs about as well as most of the other cars in the pack, which is to say that it just doesn't recognise their existence. But that means you do have to be especially careful on cold tyres, because low tyre pressures and a fundamental lack of respect for those little concrete nuisances is a great recipe for a puncture or 7. In summary, the Aston Martin GT4 has got it. It looks the part, it goes quickly, and it's one of the more engaging driving experiences of the cars in the pack, and like its big brother, I'm sure it's going to be popular. I'm not sure why it is exactly, but of all of the cars in this pack that have a GT3 equivalent, the Audi looks the most different to my eyes. Obviously the aero package on the GT3 version looks, as the kids probably don't say, aggressive AF, but somehow the GT4 version looks smaller. Now I think this has a lot to do with the way that it sits compared to the GT3 version. Minimum ride heights are much higher in GT4, and seeing a bit of daylight under these cars does take a little bit of getting used to after spending so much time with the slammed GT3 versions. The Audi was the first of the cars that I drove that led me to the conclusion that these cars have more of the essential baseline underlying feel of the road-going version than their GT3 counterparts do. This car feels mid-engined, more so than the GT3 version, though of course the engine is in the same place for both. Without as much aero to help things stick, the job of balancing momentum change is greater for the driver. That's a big part of driving any car, of course, but mid-engined and particularly rear-engined road cars, well, they do have a bit of a reputation for this. So you need to be much more aware of things like lift-off oversteer, which can be a bit more problematic. Now, it might sound like I'm telling you that the Audi's difficult, but far from it. It's incredibly intuitive to drive, and that's something I found with most of the cars in the pack. My point then is that the driving experience is a little bit more involved in a mechanical sense than the GT3 versions. As I said earlier in the video, more of the characteristics of the road-going version present themselves, and that, my friends, is a fine thing. Is it a GT car or is it a touring car? Well, it doesn't really matter, I suppose, and it's not like either of those categories is particularly well defined anyway. What I can tell you about the BMW M4 GT4 with some degree of certainty is that it's a bucket load of fun to drive. Front engine, 6 cylinders in a row, rear wheel drive, just as nature intended. It looks decent, unlike the new M4, man have you seen that train wreck, and it sounds fantastic too. The characteristic raspy exhaust note is very prevalent, and unlike a lot of the other GT cars, it's not drowned out internally by the sound of the diff and gear train whine. So from a sensory perspective, all is right with the world. As an aside, I did map the indicators, or turn signals if you're from that part of the world, but I didn't find any compelling reason to use them while driving the M4. Speaking of driving, well, that's all good news too. It's brash, just like an M car should be, but not in an over-the-top way. The front end is compliant, and with some deft left footwork, it'll go wherever you want to put it. And when you get back on the loud pedal, it has enough oversteer. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, there's enough power in the right parts of the rev range to be able to use power oversteer to your advantage, should you choose. Now, I'm not saying that's the quickest way to go, but hey, you're going to do it anyway, let's not kid ourselves. Of course, all of that, how should I put it, ease of rotation, does come at a bit of a cost, and this is a car that's a bit more edgy to drive on cold tyres than some of the more neutrally balanced offerings in the pack. Whether that means you're slower in the first lap or two than the other cars does remain to be seen, and probably has a lot more to do with you and your right foot than the other guys. If in doubt, remember the debate about whether it's a touring or GT car, opt for the former and get in a bit of door banging. It's big, it's loud, and it's as subtle as a brick to the temple. This is perhaps the car I was most looking forward to driving in the GT4 Pack. Not because I have any particular affinity to the design, or because I thought it would handle particularly well, but because of this glorious noise. That throaty goodness is produced by a naturally aspirated 6.2 litre V8, which honestly does seem like complete overkill by GT4 standards, but who am I to judge? That does seem to play into the handling though. You don't get to make an engine that size without it weighing a touch more than, say, the little 1.8 litre power unit in the Alpine. So you may notice that it does like to go in a straight line, arguably more so when you turn the steering wheel. Now, I may be exaggerating a little here, but you really do have to expect a non-trivial amount of turn-in understeer. Now, the same is true of the AMG GT3, but this is more pronounced, so you're going to have to trail brake with the best of them to tame the front axle of the Camaro. That's not necessarily a bad thing, of course, and it highlights something that I do really appreciate about the GT4 pack as a whole. There's just more variance in terms of the handling and performance from car to car than there is in the GT3 field, which in itself has quite a lot of variation. And I think that will make for more interesting, better racing and good longevity. Back to the Camaro, and like any good muscle car, it's got plenty of torque low down in the rev range, or at least it feels like it to me. When you get on the loud pedal, you can definitely induce plenty of rotation if you want, and well, if you don't. Again, we're restricted on power for the GT4 BOP, so it's not ridiculous, but it's enough to put a smile on your face, of that I'm sure. The Ginetta G55 has been knocking around for the better part of a decade in one form or another, and having done literally no research whatsoever on the specifics, I'd wager that it's probably one of the most successful cars of its type over that time period, well, at least in terms of sales. But also in terms of results, the Ginettas have had a lot of success, particularly in British GT. Like the KTM, which we'll be talking about in a moment, the G55 is powered by a relatively humble Ford Duratec V6 that you might find in a Mustang or, weirdly, some US versions of the Transit van. As an aside, I really want to try that out. But the 380-ish brake horsepower before the BOPs applied is plenty to propel the less than 1100 kilo car about the place with a fair amount of pop. This car, perhaps more than any other in the pack, feels like a lightweight sports car. It's incredibly responsive on turn-in and needs to be carefully managed throughout the mid, corner and exit stages to keep rotation in check. On cold tyres, this car, perhaps more than any in the pack, needs to be respected. It's pretty snappy at times until the tyres start to come in, and in my experience, the fronts and rears often get into the right operating window at very different times, which means that the balance of the car really does shift around during those couple of laps it takes to get from ambient temperature up to racing spec. This is a car that you really have to stay on top of. It will reward you if you're smooth, but if you're ragged and distracted, it will fight you all of the way. In fact, if you want evidence of this, check out the full race video I've uploaded on the second channel. It's time to look at everybody's favourite spaceship, and probably my favourite looking and sounding GT4 car, the KTM X-Bow. Thanks to the involvement of Writer Engineering and Dallara, the not entirely sane road-going X-Bow has been augmented somewhat, producing something that's part go-kart, part Le Mans prototype and part Batmobile. But for such an out-there looking thing, the heart of the beast is, well, a little bit more humble. The power plant is a race-tuned variant of the Volkswagen Audi 2-litre turbo, the 4-cylinder lump that you might find in an Audi S3 or a Golf R. But thanks to the exhaust layout, it does sound just a little bit more special, at least externally. One of the great advantages of the GT4 category, as I've mentioned before, is the wider variety of car types. But with that variety comes the need for more comprehensive, or perhaps even more invasive, balance of performance measures to keep everything in check. In the case of the KTM, which weighs about as much as a butterfly that's really worked hard on its summer beach body, well, that means a lot of ballast. I don't know the exact number, but I've read from other series that do publish the numbers that 2 to 250 kilograms of ballast isn't out of the ordinary in a GT4 field for the KTM, and that's a lot. And there's another big advantage of the KTM X-Bow GT4 that's been crippled. That Batmobile-style bodywork produces a hell of a lot of downforce, especially from the floor and the sizable diffuser. The cure then, as far as BOP is concerned, is a mandated minimum ride height that makes the car look like it's up on stilts. So then the driving experience is, well, it's challenging. This car is a handful. This short wheelbase little monster loves to rotate, which on turn-in is a wonderful thing, but by the mid-corner you're really wishing that the BOP man hadn't stolen all of your downforce. What that does mean is that it's just incredibly fun to throw around. Perhaps not all that effective, but fun nonetheless. On top of that, mid-range acceleration is, well, it's actually quite poor compared to some of the other cars. You will watch in horror as you get a run on a BMW, pull into the slipstream, and then just watch itself pull clear as you continue down the straight. But once you're in the corners, it is very, very fast if you can keep it from sliding. Of course, some of this may be subject to change if a different balance of performance is applied. In the preamble to this video, I mentioned that the Maserati Gran Turismo MC was, compared to the Crossbow at least, rather more civilised. And that may have been quite the understatement. These cars could barely be any more different without throwing out key philosophical concepts like wheels or propulsion. The MC is a glorious, understated piece of design, with a fairly conventional Italian V8 at the heart and a proper Grand Touring body. I mention that because, well, this is probably the most GT-like GT car in this GT4 pack. I've mentioned the diversity is what makes GT4 special, but it's nice to have a car or two at the more conventional end of the spectrum. But while the layout and spec may be more familiar, that doesn't mean that the MC is soft or dull or boring in any way. In fact, the driving experience is really on point. This is one of the most immediate cars in the pack. If you're looking to jump into a car and just get racing without having to do too much to learn about the thing, then this is probably your best choice. It's planted, balanced, and once the tyres are in the right range, just on the edgy side of neutral, which, for me at least, is pretty much perfect. The Maserati also seems pretty quick in the scheme of things, and that combination of speed and drivability should mean that this is a popular car choice. For me, there is one other factor that helps sway my affection in the direction of the MC. A very smart and talented person at Kunos was nice enough to make a template for the car customization mode, which allows for a very good approximation of another Maserati with a bit of history with SRO. Nice. You can all take what I have to say about the McLaren with a massive pinch of salt. I went in wanting to love it, as I do with, well, every McLaren, and I've come out loving it like I do with most McLarens, but I don't think this time that it's just down to my own personal biases. The road-going 570S, which the GT4 car is based on, is about one of a dozen cars McLaren are producing at present, which is a bafflingly large number for such a company. But the 570S and its GT4 counterpart have actually enjoyed a little bit of longevity compared to some of their other models, and it has to be said, the little McLaren is really very well suited to the GT4 role. The car follows the basic McLaren principle of take a carbon tub and in the middle just throw in a twin-turbo V8 wherever you like. Like the 720S in the GT3 category, this is one of the cars that really has to be heavily restricted on power from the road-going version to meet the GT4 spec and of course the BOP requirements. But critically, it doesn't feel gutless, unlike some of the other big hitters in the pack can. No, the McLaren, even missing 100 or more ponies, feels pretty athletic. It's got a fantastic front end, maybe the best in the pack, and it gathers everything up nicely through the mid and late corner phase as well. There is a hint of the usual mid-engine nervousness when you're off throttle, but it is more than manageable. For me, more than any other car in the pack, this one feels like it just doesn't miss the downforce of the GT3 cars, not even a little bit. Of course, you aren't going to be making the same kind of cornering speeds or loads, but the poise and planted feeling of a more sticky car seems to remain. I guess what I'm trying to say is that, well, this car is just really well sorted in the chassis department. And if you watched the GT4 preview live stream on Monday night, I think there will have been about a 100% chance that you'll have seen me driving this car. The Mercedes AMG GT is one of my favourite road cars. The GT3 version is probably my favourite GT3 car, and that's definitely the case in Assetto Corsa Competizione. So when I drove the AMG GT4 for the first time, I was, to put it mildly, loaded with quite a few preconceptions. Was the GT4 going to feel a bit, well, naff compared to its big brother? Would the change from that big 6.3 litre naturally aspirated engine to a more sensible 4 litre twin turbo take away some of the shine? And would the reduction in aero just make it less special to drive? The answer to all three questions is a resounding no. Starting with the new bi-turbo lump is, well, it's pretty handy, and it seems to pull well with the GT4 tune applied. And the smaller engine does mean that the characteristic turn-in understeer of its big brother is much less of an issue, since the smaller unit in the GT4 is in much more of a front-mid layout. Moving on, and as is the case with all of the other cars in this pack that share a GT3 brother, the relative lack of aero is not only no big deal, but it's actually a blessing for the most part. The same wonderfully connected driving feel is very much part of the deal with the AMG GT4. This is a car that seems to really suit the GT4 philosophy, well, much more so than some of the oddballs like the KTM or the Camaro, and as such the car feels purposeful, planted even, but with just enough of a wild side to keep things interesting. The Porsche 718 Cayman GT4 Club Sport doesn't just have the longest name in the pack, but it's also one of the quickest cars, at least from my initial testing with the pre-release builds. Of course the BOP may differ by the time you get hold of these, and of course the car might just favour my driving style. It's just not that easy to make these kind of predictions with any degree of certainty. What I can tell you, and what I can be damn sure about, is that the driving experience in Porsche's latest GT4 machine is one of the most refined in the pack. Would you expect anything less? The last generation of Cayman GT4 was, to undersell it somewhat, much loved. And arguably the shine has been taken off of the 718, at least in the road-going spec, thanks to the introduction of the 4-cylinder turbo engine throughout much of the range. But that's not relevant to the GT4, which still sports the 6-cylinder 3.8 litre Boxer engine, mounted midship, just as the Boxsters and Caymans that came before it. What that means for the GT4 car in Assetto Corsa Competizione is an extremely well-balanced car that seems to hit the perfect blend between responsiveness and drivability. Like the Audi and the McLaren, it does feel like a mid-engine car, so plenty of rotation, good and bad. But the negative side of the equation feels less prominent than in the other midship cars. Sure, there is still lift-off oversteer if you treat the accelerator pedal like a trampoline, you know who you are, but you can definitely be more aggressive with this than some of the aforementioned supercars. If you're the sort of person that likes to use lift-off oversteer to your advantage, then you'll feel right at home, and if you're not, I'm sure you'll soon learn. I'll be the first to admit that the Cayman, Boxster, Cockster, Baby 911, or whatever you want to call it, isn't really the sort of car that I'm naturally drawn to, at least not in a racing environment. But when the driving experience and the performance are as well sorted as this version in Assetto Corsa Competizione, it's hard not to leave the virtual cockpit anything but impressed. So that's all of the cars in the GT4 pack. If you want to watch me race each and every one of these, then check out the stickied links in the video description. Next up is a rundown of the new features included in version 1.5 of Assetto Corsa Competizione. I am very aware that we're probably the better part of half an hour into the video at this stage, so I will try and keep things as quick and as matter-of-fact as possible. So, obvious stuff first, and GT4 specific gameplay features have been added to both single and multiplayer. This includes the real-life 60-minute GT4 race format with one mandatory stop, no tyre changes, no refueling, and of course, no tyre blankets either. And on top of that, GT4 specific championships have been added to the single player mode as well. On the multiplayer side of things, you can restrict the server to GT3, GT4, Super Trofeo, Cup cars, or all of the above, and that means the all-important multi-class functionality has also been added to the sim. Moreover, you only need to own the class of car that you want to drive in a multiplayer race. So if, for example, you don't own the GT4 pack, you can still use a GT3 car in a race that includes both classes. This is fantastic news. There are a whole host of other small tweaks, performance improvements, and UI implementations that really aren't worth going into detail here at the end of a long video, especially as you'll be able to get your hands on the changelog in the next 48 hours or so. For me, the GT4 pack answers a fundamental question about Assetto Corsa Competizione. Does it have longevity? With a limited range of cars and circuits, that was always going to be a tough ask, even for a sim that's done a good job of settling into its role rather nicely over the last 18 months. But these cars offer a familiar, yet almost totally different driving experience, more in the mechanical than the aero realm. The cars also add in the tantalising prospect of multi-class racing, which is guaranteed to keep things interesting, so at least for now, I can say confidently that ACC will enjoy some more time in the sun. But what of the pack as a whole? Well, if it's not already completely obvious, I am a massive fan. And I can tell you that the other guys that have also been granted early access have all been excitedly singing the praises of these cars as well. At the time of recording, I don't know what the release price for the DLC is going to be, but I'm sure it will be more than worth it, especially for those of you with feet deep into the ACC community. But let's be honest, you guys were going to buy it anyway. So guys, that's pretty much it for my GT4 pack preview. Do check out the videos on the second channel if you want to see the cars in race trim, and if you've not done so, give that channel a sub while you're over there. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, it would be great if you could hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so you can see more content like this in the future. So all that's left to say is goodbye, thank you for watching, and enjoy the rest of your day.